So my name is Cindy Manginelli, and I'm with the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. If you're not familiar with the council, we are a national training and technical assistance program. We do educations, toolkits, publications, webinars, all kinds of things, advocacy work, policy work, all kinds of things at the intersection of healthcare and homelessness. And so we encourage you to go to our website to learn more. My background before coming to the council was mostly in direct services. I worked in a domestic violence shelter and a detox unit and a program for women who were seeking substance use treatment, a clinic for refugees and immigrants. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is patient engagement or consumer engagement, client engagement coming out of that background. And then I joined the council 6 years ago. And at the council, we've had a national consumer advisory board, a group of consumers, people who, while experiencing homelessness, sought care at a healthcare for the homeless, and who are now involved in advocacy and policy work and leadership in their communities. We've had a board of consumers for close to 30 years. And so I've been very honored to get to work with the National Consumer Advisory Board. Today, we're going to talk about some of the barriers to genuine consumer engagement. What we're really interested in is genuine consumer engagement, not we've got someone on our board so we can check that off the list, but genuine consumer engagement. What are some of the barriers and fears that people have around that? What are some of the strengths? What are some things that we can do to ensure that people can meaningfully engage? That's what we're going to kind of talk about today. And then we will have some time at the end for questions and answers. So please do feel free throughout the presentation to put your questions in the Q&A, and we will address those as we have time at the end. I am super excited to introduce Myra to you. Myra is a member of the National Consumer Advisory Board, and she is also the chair of the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless Consumer Advisory Board. I had the honor of sitting next to Myra for 2 days when we had some in-person meetings in Nashville of our National Consumer Advisory Board, and I just thought, she's awesome. So I was really excited to get the opportunity to have Myra talk about, from a personal experience, her experience of consumer engagement, as she is a consumer leader nationally and locally and in her hometown where she lives. So I'm going to turn it over to Myra to kind of tell her story of consumer engagement, and then we're going to kind of enter more formally into the training. And then Myra will certainly be available to take questions too. So feel free to direct questions to Myra in the chat, and we will get to those at the end. So Myra.
Hi, I am so thankful to be a part of this. And thank you, Cindy, for letting me participate and help with consumer engagement. Let me tell you a little bit about my story. I used to be unhoused. I went through substance misuse. I've had behavioral health issues, and I got involved in my consumer advisory board after I got housing. I got housing through my coalition, which is Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. And I've been a resource person, helping people advocate for many years before I realized that that's what I was doing. And then I joined the CAB, our local consumer advisory board, and was as a member for a while, and then I became the chair. I still advocate wherever I can, whenever I can. I sit on different panels, different organizations to help them with their consumer engagement and help them with better bridging the gap between healthcare centers and their consumers. So hopefully that's enough of my story to give everybody an understanding of my engagement with everyone and working on this issue so that everybody can have healthcare and housing.
Myra, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here and ask you, I think that was a beautiful statement of I was doing a lot of advocacy and consumer engagement before I knew I was doing it. So can you talk about kind of the things you were doing in your community? And then also, can you talk about how Colorado Coalition for the Homeless engaged you? What did that look like? How did they connect with you?
So I'm gonna start with how I was doing it in the beginning. When I was unhoused, I was on the streets, and I was always a tech person, so I love technology. So my thing was I wanted to learn how to get places and do things. So I started collecting all the resources and putting it together so I have a system so I can get around my unhoused. And then there was a lot of people that didn't know how to do things. So it was a lot of word of mouth. So I started sharing it with people. As soon as they didn't know where to go, what to do, I started sharing that resources. And then I was always in connection with the healthcare for the homeless, their clinic. They have housing. They have a program called PATH that helps you with behavioral health issues and help you get housing. and they have a forgiveness for eviction. So it was easy to apply there. So I applied there. I got my mental health and behavioral health. I got my dental and everything. And so that helped me on the right path to getting housing. But they had a system that really worked well. So with both of those engaged, I was able to remind people like, hey, you can go and get your dental and you can get, your housing and get all of this put together and then get your behavioral health. So that way you're not struggling with your issues and self-medicating and doing things that people do to try to, deal with the situation that they're in. But the Colorado Coalition offers, I don't know, they got hundreds of buildings. I don't know how many they have. And they have case management, they have behavioral health, they have groups and all types of things. And I participated in their groups as well, so I can get better equipped with how to cope with things that in the process from unhoused to being housed, as well as learning how to deal with substance misuse and how to start communicating with other clients, or should I say peers that are like-minded, that I wanted to progress, and helping them to understand that there's more that they could do now that they're housed, and start moving towards this level of, I want to say, this level of caring and advocating for others. So hopefully I answered those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. What I think is really striking, there are several things that I think are really striking and honestly really kind of beautiful about Myra's story. But one thing that that really is very relevant to what we're going to talk about today is that Myra had the skills and the ability and the passion and the heart to do all of this work. And the Colorado Coalition saw that, and they saw that in each other. She was able to look at the Colorado Coalition and say, oh, I like what you're doing. Look at the system you've got. That's really cool. I'm doing that too. And the Colorado Coalition was able to look at her and say, oh, wow, look at what you're doing. We're doing that too. And they were able to see in each other similar passions, similar skills, and partner together so that they both, Myra has a system and a structure to do what she does well now, what she was already doing. And the Colorado Coalition has in Myra a peer and someone who can go to people experiencing homelessness and bring the message and the work of the Colorado Coalition in a way that they can't. And so this is really what we're talking about when we talk about consumer engagement, is this, we look at each other and we go, we're doing the same thing, right? We have the same passion. We believe about the same things. How can we partner together? And that we're both stronger and better equipped to do what we were already doing because we're together. And that's really the purest, most beautiful picture of consumer engagement, I think, is that's really what we're aiming for. And so that's what we're going to talk about here a little bit. And Myra, please feel free to interrupt me at any point, and then we'll look at the questions at the end. But obviously, consumer engagement is the need, or really the demand, to include people with lived expertise in homelessness, people who've experienced homelessness, so therefore they are experts in it because they have walked it out, or who are currently experiencing homelessness in the work of ending homelessness. So let's talk, sometimes when we talk about consumer engagement, I find that people don't really want to talk about the barriers. Really, honestly, they can kind of have this conversation like it's going to be really simple and it's going to be really, beautiful. And then when it's not, sometimes they feel like, okay, we must have failed, and they're just hesitant to talk about, no, there are barriers. There are fears that people have. And the list of barriers that I'm going to go, so I say fears because some of these are not as likely maybe as we think they are, but they're fears that stop people from engaging. But this list of barriers was actually composed by our National Consumer Advisory Board. So consumer leaders composed this list. Many of them were employees at health centers, and so they were seeing both sides of this. But this was a list created by consumers. So to say, yeah, there can be barriers. The number one barrier that I think we often think about is tokenism. And what we mean by that is, we want someone who with lived experience. And so we go out and we find someone, we put them on our board, or we put them together in a room, and now we can check off the list that we have met the qualification for consumer engagement. But you as the agency don't really know how to meaningfully engage them, and they don't really feel like they're giving a contribution, and it's a lose-lose, right? And we see this all over the country, where consumers then are like, I'm not doing anything. Nothing I say is being listened to. I don't feel like I can say anything. I feel like I'm here so that you can check it off a list. And the agency feels bad too. And that's really what we want to avoid. To be honest, sometimes I think no consumer engagement would be better than tokenism, because a consumer can engage in an environment like that and decide, I'm never doing this again. I didn't bring anything. And the agency can decide this is a waste of time. And so both parties can be hurt and actually engage less in the future, which is why we have trainings like this, because we really want people to kind of count the cost and really think through their strategy, why they're doing a consumer engagement before they do it. Another barrier is that sometimes people are afraid, if we have a consumer on our board, or if we have a group of consumers who represent our agency, will they be professional? Will they say or do something that that we don't agree with or that we find offensive? I often tell the story. I've been on a couple of different groups where we experienced this here locally. I'm calling from Nashville, and it's actually a very windy day. So I'm hoping, I had a little trouble with the internet earlier. Hopefully that won't be an issue now, but we just have a extremely windy day here today. It's warm, but it's windy. So here in Nashville, actually in Tennessee, I was a part of a group, and we had a number of consumer leaders who were part of a committee. And so it was a mixed committee. We had people with lived experience and people without, and people, from all different agencies, people in the media, people from the government. But we had a strong consumer leader who was a part of the group who was extremely knowledgeable, very able to advocate really well for others. But he, in the heat of an argument, he could sometimes, when he was arguing with someone, he could sometimes be very abrasive, and in fact made some very racist and very anti-woman kind of comments. And he could do that. And so we had this conversation then around, do we own, what are we going to do? I was in another group where we were on a youth advisory board, and there was a young man who led the group who was amazing, but he struggled with an obsessive compulsive disorder. And when he got really excited, he would say the F word like 5 times in a row, just bam, 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 bam. What are we going to do about that? That's not really considered socially appropriate, right? So, so we had to talk about that, and we had to talk about it. We didn't just say, oh my gosh, and we didn't just say, you can't come back anymore. Actually, with the young man, it was decided that he would explain to new members that was what he did, and he did. And so new members were made aware of that. With the other person, we did have to have some really, really clear conversations around, you can't make comments like that. And when he continued to, he wasn't able to participate. So happy endings, not so happy endings, and obviously a little bit of mixture of both, but not letting the fact that someone may not behave in the way we want them to keep them from participating, or at least not being willing to discuss it and to bring that fear out, right? Sometimes I've talked to communities where consumers engage the work, but in so doing, they became so passionate about the work that they actually lost their housing or lost the job that they had just found. And so agencies felt bad that they engaged someone, and then it seemed that that person's personal goals kind of fell to the wayside, or maybe from an outcome perspective, they sort of digressed, right, as a result of becoming involved in the work. And so that is a concern that sometimes, especially when we look at consumer engagement, like if you're in a shelter and you have people that are living there in the shelter who form a panel or form a work group, and you think, well, now you're so focused on the work that maybe you're not focused on housing anymore. And so finding that balance of what people choose to do, right, how people choose to spend their time, but also of supporting people in their goals and finding that balance is sometimes important. Sometimes in consumer engagement, we find that the consumer group, whatever that looks like, may not be interested in engaging the work in the way that it has to be engaged. And honestly, this is something we sometimes struggle with our National Consumer Advisory Board, is like, well, what if we're really passionate about doing this, but our funders won't pay for that, or our board won't approve that? So yeah, that's a great cause. That's awesome, but it's not funded. It's not, or maybe it doesn't align with our mission, with our specific purpose. So that can be a barrier. That can be something that we need to think about and strategize about. How will we stay on mission? How will we be clear about what we can do and what we can't do? And that can happen on an agency, and it can also happen with individual staff, where sometimes you may have a staff member who is assigned perhaps to, to lead or to coordinate consumer engagement, and then just gets really distracted, like, okay, you're forgetting what we're here to do, and you're not focused on what we have to do. So finding the balance between having consumer leaders who are partnering with and aligning with and supporting and encouraging and guiding your work, but also who understand what your work is and what you can do and cannot do, both with your individual staff member who's supporting that work and as an agency. And then sometimes we find that consumers can engage, and especially if they're engaging in an agency where they're still receiving services, the line between case management and consumer engagement can get weird. So I'm coming to a meeting and I'm advocating for what I need, what I have to have, versus what I'm not really advocating for the group, right? And so, or I'm looking at that staff member, and the staff member is providing case management to me more than we're talking about the organization. And this is something that can align, that can get really blurry. And so sometimes good boundaries are needed to understand, what am I needing and what is the group of people I'm advocating for, what are they needing? And kind of like, what hat am I wearing right now? And what hat is the staff member that I'm engaging with wearing right now, right? So here I am sitting at the board meeting, I'm a board member and you're a board member, but in an hour, maybe I'll be the counsel, you'll be my counselor and I'll be the client. And so that can be tricky. That right there can really derail consumer engagement. And so everyone being clear of what hat they're wearing when, and what the boundaries are with each role, can be something that's really important with consumer engagement, and can be a barrier to good consumer engagement.
Cindy, I was going to mention something that happened in a similar situation. We had a presentation at our board, and we have brand new consumers, and they were excited to be there, and they liked advocating. And we had one that wanted to ask tons of questions, which the presenter said it was okay to ask questions during the presentation, but of course they weren't able to finish it. So I jumped in and asked them that, like, let's wait until the end and let them finish the statement. And then there was another consumer that would just add commentary because they wanted to join in, and they were so excited about what was happening. And they felt like it was that situation where you're choosing one or the other, but in reality, we were just trying to get the presentation done. So I think it's important to explain to consumers that there's a time and place, and helping them engage. But it took some time to get them to understand it. But it was nice to be able to engage with them and explain to both parties that, this is a part where we join together.
Yes, exactly. And so what you just described, some agencies won't do. They won't say, well, we can't tell them, hey, we need to get through the presentation, or we can't set any boundaries because they're consumers. Maybe they won't understand. Maybe they won't, but no, what you did is, yeah, we just said, hey, we need to get through the presentation. How do we find that balance if we feel comfortable setting boundaries? We feel comfortable talking about boundaries, because those same consumers are going to, as they grow in their advocacy and in their engagement, they may attend Metro Council meetings, they may attend other board meetings. And if you've not demonstrated, this is how these meetings usually work, these are the kinds of questions we normally ask, or how long we ask questions, then they go into other meetings ill-prepared because you've modeled something that's not sustainable, that's not culturally appropriate. So yes, that's exactly what we're thinking about. Really, I think one of the first questions to ask is, what's your goal? Why do you want to do consumer engagement? Is it, really in the core of your being as an individual who's pushing this in the agency, as an agency, really, why do we want to do this? Is it really because the bylaws say it, or our funders say it, or it sounds good to donors? What are our goals here? And to have honest conversations about that, and to decide, hey, is the reality that most of us really believe that expertise primarily comes through education and experience? Do we really believe that people experiencing homelessness can provide expertise? This is the core question to me, because the reality is we live in a society that says those who can contribute those who are experts, those who should be listened to are successful. And we gauge success by a certain standard, right? By the car you drive, or the clothes you wear, or the job you have, or your bank account. And so when we look at someone who isn't driving a car and whose clothes would reflect a lower income level, or who is sleeping someplace that we would consider unacceptable, our societal norms say they can't be an expert. They can't teach me anything. So I think we have to call that out. And I say that understanding that I can't see any of you, but I think that most of us probably don't look like real experts either by that standard. So there's that too, right? That what our society really, really values as expertise is beyond probably most of us on this call. But certainly we've been taught to believe that someone who's poor doesn't have anything to contribute. So I think we have to challenge that in ourselves. Do I believe differently? Does my staff believe differently? I think we hear like Myra's story and we realize, well, yeah, Myra was the expert. She actually went to all those places and knew what they provided and knew what people needed. We get that, right? I mean, that's obvious. But as we're explaining that to our board, to our donors, to some members of our staff, how do we explain that? Do we believe it, and how do we communicate it? That we believe in the valuable and irreplaceable contribution of people who have lived through this. Do we desire to conduct work that is relevant and is informed by the community of those we're trying to help? Do we believe they have expertise to offer? And are we prepared to offer whatever support is needed to bring that expertise to the table? So let's talk about options. We talk about a consumer advisory board, and sometimes that is kind of the default of what we talk about, but a consumer advisory board can be a lot of work. And so we try more and more to talk about what are the other options. A consumer advisory board would be a board, and we think about a board, we think about a governing group, a group that is offering guidance that has to be listened to, right? That's what we typically mean by a board. This is a group that would have governance materials, they would have bylaws, they would have regulations. And so a consumer advisory board can be a wonderful way of consumer engagement, but it is on the list here, it does represent probably the one that is the most involved and that requires the most staff support and the most work. So, but a consumer advisory board would function very much perhaps like your board of directors. They would have regular meetings, they might have subcommittees, they would be tasked with providing guidance to the organization, guidance that has to be adhered to. So there would be clear ways that information is shared with that board, and clear ways that the information, the discussion that's generated by that board is shared with your organization and implemented. Right, so a board would, and then there would be guidelines around how that happens. A consumer work group is a little bit simpler. Very often with a work group, we think about a group of consumers who are gathered for a specific purpose for a specific amount of time. So, for example, I was working with a shelter that wanted to redo its entire waiting room. Wanted to redo entire parts of its building, but they wanted consumer perspective on that. So they gathered a group of 10 to 15 people who had received services there. I don't think they currently were, but 10 to 50 people who, while experiencing homelessness, had received services at that agency. And they said, all right, we're going to meet 3 times in the next 6 weeks to get your feedback on this project. And when the project is over, this work group will be dissolved. So it has a very clear beginning, it has a very clear ending, it has a very clear purpose. And so this is sometimes a more manageable way of seeking consumer involvement. And you don't need all the governance materials and some of those other things. A panel is similar. Some people will have a panel of consumers that they use that engage the health center or the agency as sort of a standing group. So it could be even a group that meets in person, or I've even seen consumer panels that worked just over email. And basically it was like, okay, the six of us are your consumer panel. And when you have questions, when you have issues, you email the 6 of us and we all send in our answer. And it's that simple, right? or it could be a group that meets once a month and we discuss whatever issues, whatever questions we have at the time. But without, they understand why they're assembled, but they may not have a specific task. They may just be there to serve almost like a group of consultants. And then some people do just use consumer consultants. They have a list of subject matter experts who all have lived experience, and they kind of know that they're on call. Very often they're compensated and compensation is a bigger topic that we're not going to talk a whole lot about today. We certainly encourage compensating all experts, and consumer experts included. We know that can get tricky. I'm sending out links, and there is a link that I'm sending out that talks specifically about how to think about compensating people who may be receiving benefits without compromising those benefits. So that's a big topic that we're not going to get into a whole lot today. But some people just have a list they maintain of consumer subject matter experts. And when I need help, we need help engaging a client who's struggling with substance use disorder, man, we don't know what to do, and we want to talk to someone who's been there. I've got 5 names on a list of people I can talk to. And we use them just like we would a consultant for any other category, right? And they're available kind of on demand, kind of on retainer, even some agencies do it that way. Certainly you can include board members on your board. This is the most common form of consumer engagement that I see, and I believe it's probably the least effective, is to just say, yep, we've got 2 board members that are consumers, and I hope they can figure it out, right? Lots of onboarding needed, lots of training needed. Do those people have the technology to engage? Do they have the skills needed to engage? When you send out a board packet, do they understand what expectations are around that? So, and do your other board members respect their opinion as and the kind of expertise that they bring? Very important questions to ask if you're just including consumers on your board. Lots of pre-work to be done, lots of ongoing work to be done to ensure that they feel comfortable contributing. Another really strong way to engage consumers is to hire people with lived experience. Very often on our job descriptions here at the council, we will include those with lived experience are encouraged to apply, or lived expertise is highly valued. And we do have a number of staff who have experienced homelessness or who have experienced some of the other issues that we engage here at the council. And so making that a priority can sometimes be a real meaningful way of engaging consumers. Of course, the reality is more than likely you have people on your staff right now who have experienced homelessness. What's different about consumer engagement is that I'm walking through the door, and what brings me to the door is the fact that I've lived this, right? You have members on your staff probably who have experienced homelessness, and they don't ever have to tell anyone if they don't want to. That's not what got them at the door. That's not what opened up the seat at the table. For consumers, this is the expertise I bring. And so you can imagine the complications around my life story is what brings me to the table. My life story is my expertise. So it's not really hard for me to say, yeah, I'm an expert because I worked in these 5 places and I've done this research and here I am, I'm an expert. It's a little more personal to say I'm an expert because I lived this, right? So when we think about staff, we have to think about how do we create an environment, a trauma-informed environment, where it's safe to both tell and not always have to tell your story. And that is your basis for expertise. So again, lots of issues, lots of things to think about as you think about hiring people with lived experience and making that a way that you are pursuing consumer engagement. And then peer support is, of course, a huge way to do consumer engagement, is to have people, whether they're employed or not, who, like Myra said, she could go out and talk to people about the resources in a way that no one else at the coalition could, because she's walked through those doors and pursued resources in those places. She knows what to expect, right? I can make a ton of referrals, but not really know what the people that I'm referring are going to expect, right? So peer support is a big one too, to be intentional about setting up different systems of peer support. So as we think about engaging consumers in all these different levels, it's important to have a job description. And again, this is to avoid tokenism. So that I don't just go, hey, you've experienced homelessness and I think you've received services here, so you must be appropriate, right? But what is the job description? Whether it's for a board member or someone who's going to sit on our cab or someone who's going to be available as a subject matter expert, what are we really needing? And to not be afraid to ask that question, to say, this is what we're looking for, so that it is genuine, it is meaningful. That will depend on the role. The qualifications for a board member may be very different from someone who's going to sit on a work group. We talked about the possibility of someone getting engaged in consumer engagement and then being distracted from their personal goals, especially if it's someone who's still receiving services from you. Is that going to be a conflict that's difficult for your agency? Are they able to represent and advocate for others? This is huge. So do I come to the meeting and only represent what I need, right? What I am troubled by, what I was bothered by when I received services? Or can I think big picture about what my community is needing? What would be best for my community is a huge part of consumer engagement. Can they recognize social and cultural norms? Just like, we're talking about consumer engagement, but the reality is I would be looking at this list for any board member, right? I've been on plenty of boards with board members who were abrasive and harsh and inappropriate, and they had never experienced homelessness, right? This is not a criteria that would be specific to people who've experienced homelessness. And we should not have put them on our board because they didn't know how to sit in a meeting. And their income had not taught them how to sit through a meeting. It's really important to realize. So a lot of these questions we would ideally be asking for anyone that we're engaging as an expert. Are they able to ask for help? Are they able to gauge that they have the time and energy and capacity to do this work? And sometimes consumer engagement can be a little selfish, and we can ask people to engage, especially if there's someone who's still receiving services and they may feel very obligated. They may feel like they kind of owe the agency because of the help they received. They may feel like, well, if I say no and I need services again, will I not get it, right? Are there strings attached? So do people have the freedom to say, man, I can't do that, or I can do it, but I can do this much? Do they understand that there's no strings attached? Really clear communication. Are they passionate about the mission of your agency? I'm really amazed at how many times I will talk to an agency about consumer engagement, and they'll say, yeah, we have these 5 people on our consumer advisory board, and I'll go and talk to the consumer advisory board, and some of them will be like, I hate this place. I'd never want to stay here again. Or I think they're, like, this staff member was awful. And it's like, you've put someone on your board who hates you. Are you finding people who believe in your mission, who believe in what you do? Certainly they may have had negative experiences, but if you find someone who's they're just, they're really angry in general, are you passionate about the work that we're doing? Do you believe that's work that can be done? Or do you believe it's all kind of pointless, right? Certainly it helps if they're familiar with your agency, although I do work with organizations that will only engage consumers who have never received services from them because they're afraid that those boundary issues that we discussed. So some do the opposite and say, we only bring in people who are not familiar with our agency. There's pros and cons both ways. Probably deciding which one you want to do would be helpful and important. As we think about whether we're doing a board or a panel or having consumers who are kind of on retainer, however we want to engage, we want to be sure that we have clear expectations. There, to me, is this last one here about managing expectations for immediate results. It is so frustrating, and I think even sad sometimes, to engage a consumer who works really hard on a project for like a year, and at the end of the year, and we say, okay, that project's done, thank you, and they say, but people are still homeless, right? Wait, I didn't make a difference. What did we do? What did we accomplish? Because some of the work that we do, we all know this, I've been coming to work every day for a long time, and when I drive out of my subdivision, the same homeless man is still there, right? So So I have to have ways that I talk to myself about the work that I'm doing and what I can impact and what I can't. And we have to do that with our volunteers on all fronts, but with consumer engagement as well. This is what your project is going to accomplish. You're going to conduct this survey. You're going to create the survey, you're going to conduct the survey, and then we're going to take the information from the survey to improve this. So this is the end game. So yes, there may not be anyone who gets housed because of this survey, but this information will go to this person, so creating a vision for this is what you're doing. Removing as many barriers as possible. Will we need to provide transportation? Will we need to provide technology, childcare? Will people miss their opportunity to have a meal because they are engaged? How will we need to compensate them? These are all questions to think through. Explaining the outcomes. This is what we're doing and why. This is how this project will have an impact. Offering all the training and orientation that's needed. And so being really careful to count the cost for staff involvement. Do you really have the staff? And staff involvement is huge. We very often see consumer, cabs and other things that kind of fall apart because they didn't really have the staff capacity to support them. Being really up to date on trauma-informed practices. What does it look like to engage a group of people who have lost everything? To engage a group of people who perhaps have been very accustomed to being ignored or even hated, right? Being aware of the stigma of homelessness and how some people may have experienced that. Being flexible is a big one. So the questions we're asking here are, do we have the capacity and the infrastructure for consumer engagement, right? Do we have the staff in place? Do we have the space? Do we have the technology? All of these are questions that we're asking because, again, we don't want to engage consumers and then realize, oh, wait, right, we didn't think of this. How would the information be shared with and received from consumer leaders? And this is a huge issue in consumer engagement, is we form this panel or we form this work group and we come and ask them questions and they give answers and there's good discussion and that's it. It never gets anywhere. So if we're going to form this group and if there's going to be discussion, how is that going to get to the right people, right? And based on what we're discussing, are the people who actually make those decisions going to listen to this group, right? So that's really important to think through. Some agencies will get together and they'll form a consumer advisory board or a consumer panel together so that we say, okay, our consortium or our 6 agencies here, we're going to get together and we're going to have a group of consumers who inform all of us, right? And I'm seeing a lot of communities go to this model. But how does that information get from the consumers to these different agencies? And how do the different agencies determine what will be asked of the consumers and what kind of things they will discuss? So this pipeline has got to be really clear. I know that when we talk about this in a meeting, it's going to affect change because it's going to go to this person and to this group and to the board or whatever, right? Or if our funders have a question that would really be best answered by those who've received services here, how does that funnel back and forth, right? One thing that can happen is that people can just say, well, just go ask them, and not really think that through of a funder talking to a group that they've not met. It's from a totally different background. So that's a really important part of your infrastructure to think through. How would information from consumers leaders impact your work? How's it actually going to make a difference? And is there room for non-traditional ideas? This is when we talked about this a little bit at the beginning of what if the consumer group wants to do things that we're not funded to do or that contradicts with our mission, good things to do, but it's not what we do. And so again, if I'm going to go to a group of people and say, hey, your background is totally different than the background of our board and the background of our staff and the background of our funders. So what do you guys think? And you create this space where they can come up with lots of creative ideas and brainstorm, but your funders won't hear that, or your board can't hear that, or your staff even can't hear that, then you just create a lot of frustration. We see this happen a lot, where we've got this really cool group and they're excited, they're motivated, but no one else is necessarily everyone else is really happy with the way things are. So again, those foundational questions of, do we really want to receive consumer input, and can we really accept it? So I also have a link with lots of resources that's going to come through tests, and lots of resources on our website. The Camden Coalition has some amazing resources, and I put those in there too. What questions do you have for us as you think through the information that we've shared? What are some questions that you have, or comments that you have? What do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you both so much. This is so amazing. And speaking for myself, but I'm sure other people too, this is such a valuable resource and just really, really good stuff. We have a couple things in the chat, but yeah, everyone definitely add any other questions or just comments. I think it's also an opportunity here to sort of engage with each other and have some dialogue. I also see someone who's had their hand raised. Kara K, I'm going to allow you to talk. I'm not sure if that was on purpose. Maybe not. I'm always accidentally raising my hands in webinars, so let me know if that was on purpose. All right. So we have a question here that says, what are the compensation guidelines you recommend, and what forms of payment do you recommend and have seen to be most streamlined from an organizational or administrative perspective?
Myra, what do you all do? What have you seen done?
So I sit on several different of those types of things listed. So one of my consumer advisory board, we get a gift card from a grocery store. And then of course they feed us. That tends to help a lot, feeding us first, and then compensating us. And there's another panel I sit on where they pay us in it's like a regular gift card, but that can be reloaded. And I've sat on one of those temporary ones. It's the same thing where it's and if we were in person, because some of it was during the pandemic where we sat in person, we sat online and virtual, and we were still compensated on that virtual card, and then we engaged that way. But in person, they always fed us too. So I think that I don't know why the feeding is important, but I think that once you receive good food, opposed to the food that you can afford, it seems like it's gets you in your mind in the right set to actually contribute more. And the more they're allowed to contribute, the more they want to come back.
Oh, it's a really good point. And that I've seen that across the country, honestly, same kind of model. Certainly that the food is provided, that transportation often is provided both to and from the event. This is something we try to really talk to consumer experts about. Like, is it going to be a problem if you're compensated? If you do we will have experts like Myra who may contribute to a big publication or to an all-day series, and it may be hundreds of dollars that we would be compensating them. So we try to ask, is this going to be an issue? So sometimes we just compensate them just like we do other SMEs, and we send a check, or we do a direct deposit, however we're compensating other SMEs. There are organizations, we've used gift cards quite a bit. I love the idea of the reloadable gift card. I've not thought of that. That would be much simpler than what we've done sometimes. I've also seen health centers that when there are people who either can't be compensated because it may conflict with their benefits, they've tried to think about what services can we connect you with. That if you really, even a gift card you feel like is problematic. Some people are very nervous about getting a gift card and afraid it's going to, even that kind of total will add to something that's going to mess up their benefits. And so whether that's bus passes or some sort of something like that you can use, or a service that they can connect you with either at the health center or at the in the community, that's another way. But I did include a link in the packet that talks about compensation too, and other creative ways to get around or to think about compensation without affecting people's benefits. And I think it actually provides some guidelines around that too. So definitely check out that link that I sent to. That is a tricky issue though. That does get really complicated, especially if you're asking someone to spend hours and hours and you really want to compensate them, but they're concerned about that with their benefits. But gift cards are definitely the most common thing that we see across the country.
Great. Seems like we're definitely seeing some folks echoing in the chat the importance of providing food during meetings and stuff. So people have a good experience with that. So there's another question. It's a little bit geared towards the consortium, but I wouldn't know the answer to it. Someone's wondering about whether or not the consortium could create a directory of consumers that have agreed to participate in CABs. I'm thinking about this as a central resource that organizations could use to engage consumers that aren't receiving services from them, which I think is interesting. You know, it must be it can. I think the consortium can relate. It's hard to not just always be relying on the same people, the same consumers, same people you've engaged with. But curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, actually, we worked with a couple of different groups that have done this kind of in reverse, where the consumer leaders got together and said, hey, everybody wants our expertise. So let's get together and let's form our own consumer, whatever you call it. I think I've talked to one in California. It's like the lived experience advisory board. And so they formed together. They got really organized. They found people who would fund them even. And then they advertised to agencies like yours, hey, we're all here. And these are our areas of expertise. They actually did like a media bureau. They did like a speakers guild kind of thing. And so people could go to them and say, I need an expert on this, or I need a speaker on this. And so that is something that we're seeing a little bit more across the country, where consumers are actually being encouraged to hey, your advice, your expertise is in demand. And they're organizing around that. We're also seeing, I've worked with a few groups across the country where they did get together, sort of like what you described, and formed this group. But the complications were around what kind of experts are we looking for? Who's going to compensate the experts? How often will they meet and who will staff it? But they were able to kind of work that out and say, all right, my agency will provide, every agency said we'll provide 2 consumers, and we'll go out and recruit 2 consumers. And then together we'll have this board that'll be really diverse. So that's another way to do it too, is to kind of work together and recruit. I'm working with a group right now in Vermont that's looking at saying, okay, we all employ consumers. So what if we had a meeting of our community health workers or our peer support specialists, and they all met and served sort of like as a consumer advisory board? They're already being paid, right? They already get staff support because they're our own employees. What would that look like to have this group also serve as a board? And that would be part of their job description even. And so those are different ideas that you can kind of play around with and think about partnering together. But we are seeing more and more people who are realizing, hey, we could do this together. Our agency is so small, we can't do it on our own, but we could do this together. And of course, Tess, you and I talked about different options around that too, even. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so stay tuned, everyone, to see where the consortium lands on our own journey of this. We're very much on it as well. But I love all of the things you mentioned, but especially that thing you mentioned about the group in California, sort of like organized together. I think that's a really cool model. And if you know the name of it and are able to share it.
Yes, I will. And I have a contact there. Don't let me forget after this. But yeah, we have a contact there, and they could talk to you about that too. Yeah, they're awesome.
Okay. Someone's asking about if places have grant money to get these initiatives off the ground. Is that something you can get funding for?
Do you have any experience with that, Myra?
So the one panel that I was on that it ended, we actually presented at the conference. It was a grant for working on the issue with unhoused. And so there was grant money, and they used some of the grant money to pay the consumers as well as the different outings, but it also was for, using all the research and contacting people too. But I was more on the consumer side, but they gave me a little bit of more information, but it was a grant. There was a grant writer on that panel. So yes.
Yeah, and I've seen other agencies that used consumer engagement for under capacity building. And so they would apply for grants that were funding specifically capacity building, and consumer engagement could go under that. And then I've also worked with foundations that were looking at specific kinds of projects, like maybe mobile health or harm reduction or something. And then they were willing to fund consumer engagement as part of that too. So I've seen that many times where when applying for a grant and it's under a certain topic, or it's for a certain project, just including consumer engagement in that.
Mm-hmm. Somewhat related, kind of. Do any consumer advisory boards get discretionary funding to be able to implement their own projects? Is that something you've seen?
I have seen consumer advisory boards that that applied for grants for specific projects. I've not seen that a whole lot. Um, Now, for example, our National Consumer Advisory Board, we're funded primarily through HRSA, through the federal government, and we will write into our cooperative agreement with HRSA specific projects that our Consumer Advisory Board is passionate about. So we will include that in our work plan. And then we have seen but we have seen consumer groups that have applied for grants for specific projects. You have to be very well organized and structured to do that. But yes, I have seen groups that were successful in doing that. I mean, I've seen consumer groups where consumers took grant writing courses, and said, "Hey, we're gonna make this work." Like the lived expertise advisory board that I mentioned, where they said, we're gonna go out to funders and we're gonna get this funded. And so yeah, I've not seen a whole lot of groups who've done that, but I have seen groups who did it very well. So yeah, that is absolutely possible.
Great. And I know you've given some examples about different models of engaging consumers. I'm wondering if you could share an example of one model or that you found to be like especially effective and like a concrete one. I know you mentioned Vermont and you mentioned California, but if there's anything that really jumps out to you as a group that has been really successful.
Myra, I would consider your group to be very successful. Do you want to talk about the coalitions group?
Well, our cab is pretty successful and engaging with consumers, but there's been other panels that I sat on which was really successful at getting the information from the unhoused. The Elevated Denver, which is as an organization, they just became an organization that are seeking out and doing interviews and getting and collecting data from a different point of view. That was really good because they can get a lot of information they weren't getting that other organizations like the CCH, the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, is not able to get because the clients aren't like we talked about in this presentation that feel uncomfortable about talking about. So in the Elevated Dinner, we were able to do interviews one-on-one, especially with me being the interviewer, getting information that people didn't feel comfortable talking about, like how it was hard to get resources because they were looked down on. And so they were able to get that data of what resources were more valuable and what weren't. But as a CAB, we do a couple meetings with our consumers and ask them more about what they need. And so we can provide it throughout the organization. Of course, as a consumer, it's easier for me to ask opposed to a staff.
Surveys. Honestly, some of the most successful examples of consumer engagement that I've seen is surveys, where consumers created the survey and then went out and asked questions and were able to receive information that an agency could never have received. Yes. And so surveys, we didn't talk a whole lot about that, but surveys are, it has a beginning and an end. And so that can make it a little simpler. But some of the best work I've seen in consumer engagement was around a well-crafted and delivered survey where people sat down with people experiencing homelessness and people just shared because it was a peer, and then brought that back to the organization, and they were able to make real change, able to impact real change significantly as a result. So yeah, I would agree surveys are huge. The Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, I think, is a big example. There are some agencies we've worked with in California too California's gotten very organized around consumer engagement in some ways, and they've gotten a lot of funding toward consumer engagement there. So there's some examples there too. But as far as concrete actions that I think are simple and can be very effective, I think surveys are huge in that regard.
Great. And speaking of surveys, there's some housekeeping on my end. Because we're at the end of our session, I'm sharing a link in the chat. We'd love for everyone to fill this out so we can hear what other topics would be of use. And I'm also launching a quick evaluation poll that we'd love your response on. So those are in the chat, and I'm not seeing any other questions. So we will follow up with the slides and the recording on all of the amazing resources And yeah, I just want to say a huge thank you to Cindy and Maya. This is incredible, and we're really grateful that you were able to offer this today.
It's good to see you all. Have a good afternoon.